in Afghanistan. Some of you may know him as a diplomat in Iraq, Indonesia, and Bosnia. All of you will certainly know him as a podcaster, I'm sure, and the host of The West is Politics. And many of you will know him as well as the author of this tremendous book. I have to read a lot of books for my job, and I have to say this one was a joy to read. If you haven't read it, you must read it. Even if you're not deeply concerned with the sort of state of British politics, let me tell you, Rory is not shy about spilling some tea on this book, and there is some really fun stuff in there as well. So, I mean, it's a ridiculously exhaustive curriculum detail there. I haven't even gone into the fact that you walked the four corners of the earth practically, that you served also in the British military, and so on and so forth. But I guess the place to start right now is you've just come back from Paris. You were there, obviously, with your kids, but you were also on top of the French election. And I just wonder what you take from the results of the French election.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. French election, the first thing is that polling seems to go wrong very regularly all the way around the world. So I was there both for the second round this week. And as you know, at the end of the first round, the prediction was going to be that the far-right, Marine Le Pen's party, was going to run home in first place. And we were going to have a second place for the left and a third place for Macron. In fact, the many, many good reasons in French history. We do not want that kind of party governing us. But we think less about far-left populism. And Mélenchon is a very, very peculiar figure. That Front Populaire, that left-wing coalition, was the big winner there was Mélenchon. He got more seats than the old socialists, that we like. More extreme than Jeremy Corbyn's party, getting more seats than Labour. And it's a sign that Macron's style of government, which I guess would appeal to many of the citizens, wanting it to me, right? It's kind of bold, charismatic, intelligent, technocratic, trying to solve the big problems of France, is profoundly unpopular for whatever reasons. And the kind of things he's trying to do, famously he's been trying to put the retirement age up from 62 to 64, and that's kind of almost pillaged the country. He's been trying to deal with reforming the trains. I mean, the French trains are impressive, but they have 50 billion euros worth of debt. The debt deficit in France is even more out of control than it is here in the UK. And the response, of course, has been British, and the first response was, in his first term, people wearing jackets even more dramatically coloured than Clarissa's. Yes. And then the second time round there were these almost no compromise vote. And now a real sign, and this is, I suppose, the thing I'll finish on, a sign of these kind of strange phenomenal leaders trying to, I don't know, assert themselves in difficult situations by these sort of macho risks. And we've had a number of examples of that. We had this with Hamza Yusuf, who withdrew in South Africa as the first leader in Scotland. We had this with Rishi Sunak, who tried an election completely unnecessarily, 6 months early, which he was guaranteed to lose. And we've just had a Macron who's just lost any chance of governing the country. Instead of what he talked about, which was a moment of clarity, France has been left with 3 parties with completely different voter bases, totally different ideologies, who detest each other, sharing the palm of the king.
I mean, let's talk about the broader European picture when we can see, in particular, the European election this year.
Yes, I felt passage on that, thank you. When we look at the European elections, when we see the rise of extremes on both sides of the political spectrum, what do you think is contributing to that? I mean, we talked about several different contexts.
We'll come to the UK election in a second, but before we do, just help us understand why you believe it is that the centre
I mean, literally, if you look at opinion poll illustrations of that period, the graph is a bell jar, right? All the votes are where my fingers are, they're not where my elbows are. And this was a period where everybody broadly agreed that in economic terms, they were in favor of globalization, free trade, privatization, deregulation. Politically, there was this explosion of democracies. The number of democracies literally doubled between 1988 and it was an era of a liberal an idea that faced pressure. The idea was, if you were right in the inner circle of sort of Tony Blair's government, if you were one of the Miliband brothers, for example, a lot of the time you sort of thought government was about getting a really cool policy paper from sliding down. And then something began to change. And by 2014, we're into very dramatic change. So 2014, Narendra Modi's elected, Putin goes into Crimea, 2015 the Poland, 2016 the Brexit referendum, 2018 Bolsonaro, 2016 of course, most dramatically of all, Donald Trump. And everything has turned on its head. So instead of global free trade, we're moved into a world of protectionism. So in the US, there's no appetite for free trade. In fact, they've tariffs 110% on the import of Chinese electric vehicles. Instead of privatization, deregulation, markets, we've willed to a world of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is basically industrial strategy, government picking risk. In the political sphere, the move away from democracy has been very dramatic. So every year since 2014, the number of democracies has declined. In Africa, in just over a year, there were 8 military coups. 8 military coups, elected governments replaced by dictatorship. And instead of intervention, right, instead of chasing around the world, we're in a world of isolation. So, represented by Obama not responding to the red lines that he drew in Syria, represented by us not being involved in Yemen, represented most dramatically by something that Clarissa witnessed and went through very, very intimately, and has reported on very beautifully, which was this extraordinary withdrawal from Afghanistan, where Biden essentially just whipped the rug out and the whole place collapsed in a matter of weeks. I mean, and that probably is what I want to kind of end on as a way of understanding what happened. That's probably the most dramatic indicator of all. If you're looking for a symbol of why people have lost faith in the old center, the old technocratic elites, you could talk about democracies not delivering rising inequality. You could talk about the way that if you're looking for a symbol internationally, it's the Taliban. Public opinion has gone from this bell jar which I showed you, right, where the votes where my fingers are, the U-shape, right? So now the votes where my elbow is, no longer my left elbow, no longer where my hand is.
So some of us, before you came along, were feeling maybe optimistic about this election here in the UK. And then I read an op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times where you said that this election is not, quote, the centrist triumph that it appears to be. Can you explain that for this audience? Because I do think that there is quite a lot of optimism, depending on who you talk to, obviously, but you make some really important points about the first past the post versus the popular vote. And yeah, what are the challenges and what's the reality? What are we not seeing?
So, look, I mean, the good news first. The good news first, we got rid of a completely hopeless conservative government for a certain time and needed to be boosted out. That's good news. To develop that, Labour now has an enormous, record-breaking majority. I mean, it's sort of eye-watering. Literally, we've not seen majorities like this ever, and the Conservative defeat also breaks all records. 200-year history of the Conservative Party. They've So on the surface, it feels like an incredible repudiation of the kind of right-wing moves that were being made under Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, and now we're back to a sort of social democratic centre. Feels like new Labour. Feels like, I don't know, Schroeder's back. We're back to the 90s. We're back to the kind of glory days of kind of. And you know, let me develop that a little bit more. Why does it feel like that? Partly also because the way that Labour talks sounds exactly like my description in the 1990s. Right, this is a government that talks about democracy and human rights, the rule of law. It's a government that talks about being a responsible international player. It's a government that talks about open trade. And it's also a government that's actually about mini austerity. I mean, this is the Labour government's just won an election saying they're going to cut £18 billion from public spending, taxes, and they're going to reduce the national debt, right? So this is very, very orthodox neoliberal economics, straight out of central casting from the 1990s, and they just won a huge majority. So the whole thing seems spectacular. Of the Rory Stewart vision of politics, right? Back to this. Except we haven't, because if you look at the figures, it doesn't remotely look like that victory that Tony Blair won in 1997. Scratch just a little bit under the surface, you find that, in fact, the election has it's broken records in a very negative direction. It got a lower percentage share of the vote than any party taking office ever. Okay? Just over, almost exactly 1/3 of the British population, and they've ended up with over 400 out of 650 seats in Parliament. Second thing, the two main parties, Labour and Conservative combined, are barely hitting 60%. This again is share of the two main parties ever recorded. We've gone into a world in which basically other parties are coming through. And again, we're misled. The Lib Dems did fantastically well over 70 seats, but they did so because they squeezed every last vote they could in all the key constituencies, and they piled them up where they needed to, and they didn't put them anywhere else. The reality is that the Lib Dems got 10% when Reform, the far right, got 17%. Now, we don't see that because it ended up, because the way they put their votes, right, they concentrated their votes in southwest England and areas around London, they ended up with getting a massive multiple, 15 times as many seats, despite getting 50% less of the vote. Reform is second in 100 seats, and the Labour majorities are very, very thin. I was watching it on the night after night as the results come in. Labour's just scraping through. Often these seats that Labour's taking, they're getting less, both in share of the vote and in numbers of they were getting in those seats in 2015. So this is a world really, and a final fact, right? Keir Starmer has the lowest net popularity rating of any incumbent Prime Minister in British history. Right? He's coming in with very popularity ratings. In other words, this was a vote to boot out the Conservatives. It was a vote helped by the fact that Reform and the Lib Dems took enormous numbers of seats away, which the Conservatives could have won, either by taking them directly like the Lib Dems or having. But what it is not is an endorsement of Labour. And this is where I then get worried, because I then worry, look, if they actually do what they say they're going to do, which is try to cut £18 billion worth of public spending, not borrow any money, not raise any taxes, they're going to have some very, very angry people, because the health services are creaking, education infrastructure is creaking, our trains don't work, our roads don't work. Where's the money going? Where's the money going? And the result then is that in 5 years' time, the populist backlash against this will be very quick. And remember, the big word for politics in France, in Britain, is volatility, anti-incumbency. Boris Johnson in the last election had a record-breaking majority, and Labour had its worst defeat since the 1930s. The whole thing flips on its head.
You know, this is from the early 90s, and I think that one of the major differences which you touched upon is that we don't really live in a unipolar world right now. It's no longer the days after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain. And when you look at what's going on in the U.S. and election, this obviously has a dramatic impact that reverberates globally. I just wonder what your impressions are, and I don't know how forthcoming you're willing to be about this, about what we are seeing taking place right now in the U.S. in terms of the presidential election, what we saw at the debate, what we have seen in terms of President Biden's refusal to adhere to any calls for him to step down, to usher in new blood, younger blood, and the fact that it is really coming down to this moment in the leading country in the free world between and a man who struggles to get a sentence out.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. How many people in this audience? It's a slightly unfair question. So, look, if you don't stick your hand up, I'll just take it that you're being discreet. We'll assume. But how many people in this audience, though, want Trump to be defeated? So let's say it's the whole audience. Okay. Now, second question: how many people in this audience think that Biden should step down? Okay, so this is really interesting for me because this would not be the results in the US, right? If I went to talk to a room where people were committed to defeat Trump, people would be very, very troubled and conflicted about the question. And I fear it's because they are too close to it. I think you're right, and I agree with you. But that's because we have a certain amount of distance. It's also because we're not in the weeds of the way the Democratic Party machine works. I brought up the question of how is it done, how do you get rid of Biden, who comes in next, what happens to the money that's been raised, what happens to delegates that are being pledged, etc. But the US and Democrats need to get there. They need to work backwards. How many people think that if Biden runs against Trump, he will lose? Okay, so this is important. That's all you really need to know. If, like me and the majority of people in the room, you think that Biden is going to lose, then you have, it's complicated, it's messy, who knows who you're going to end up with. But if the candidate you've got is going to lose, then there's no point faffing around. The path to Biden's victory is so infinitesimally narrow now. Right? It depends on so many peculiar assumptions. And so many Democrats in good faith are trying to make the arguments for Biden because they cannot bear the risk involved in trying to replace him. But this is an election that will be decided potentially by 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Far too many people now have been given permission to vote for Trump. Right? If you're somebody who's been embarrassed to vote for Trump, you can now say, look, I'm sorry I don't support Donald Trump, but unfortunately this guy's senile running the country. It's a bit like three friends who need an excuse to vote for Rishi Sunak. They were like, no, and of course I don't vote for Rishi Sunak, but we can't give Labour a supermajority. Is that correct? People like alibis kind of vote for him. But it's also true that just for the sake of the world, this line that's being switched, this is a decision for Joe and Jill, is bullshit. This isn't a decision for Joe and Jill. Right? This is that they get to choose what socks he puts on. Right? They don't get to choose the future of the entire free world. It's not just up to them. shouldn't be just the problem, even if Biden were to make it, and I think it's vanishingly unlikely now that he can make it. Right, the polls after the 70% of Americans now think he's unfit to be president. Right, so even the people voting for him are voting for him with their noses held. But the reason for this is that it's not good enough to say he's got a good team and he's done a good job. You cannot lead with a good team in a vacuum in the centre. And the major thing you can't do is you can't play a role on the international stage. The American presidents who traditionally have asserted themselves in the Middle East peace process, in Russia, Ukraine, in Europe, with China, have to be able to do so by communicating. They have to be able to speak. They have to be able to hold a room, even if that's just an intimate room. And at the moment, we have a president who can read off a teleprompter, and that's not good enough. It's not good enough to say he did badly in the debate, but he did fine in the latest speech, so he can read. Unfortunately, he sometimes reads too much. I mean, a month ago he was reading his teleprompter and he went, 4 more years, pause. That's what the brackets is for. You're not going to read that.
But, the Biden administration would say, first of all, don't believe the polls, which, I think you yourself would acknowledge. And they will also say that name recognition is so hugely important for many necessarily politically astute or well-informed. And so the fact that whoever would potentially take Biden's place might not have that level of recognition with the broader voting populace. But this does kind of segue nicely into about your book, which I'm giving another shameless plug here for you. Because I think
it's not shameless when you do it. It's shameless when
I do it. Yeah. So I thought this book was really brave and really important for so many reasons. If it was designed to make us feel state of democracies, I'm not sure it achieved that objective, except that it is so tremendously important to be kind of transparent about the problems, the inconsistencies, the inadequacies. What was your goal in writing this book? What did you want to achieve?
Well, thank you. I wanted to try to show what it was really like. I mean, my dream was to try to do the sort of thing, I don't know whether you've read those books written by surgeons about what it's like working in a hospital. I wanted to try to let you see inside the machine and see how completely, insanely dysfunctional it is. And the only way that I think you can bring that alive is by really just small anecdotes. I mean, often the things that resonate with people is stuff that I was tempted not to put in the book at all. One example is I've been trying for 2 years to get broadband in my constituency. Set up these volunteers, they're in these villages, and kind of out on mole plows, digging trenches, and I'm getting a tiny amount of money. The Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Mr. Jeremy Hunt, who's in charge of broadband, is going to come up to my constituency 350 miles north of London, and I've summoned all my broadband activists to meet him. And this is literally all I'm doing, because I've managed to offend and I go to the webs and I say, could I please be slipped to go up to my constituency because this is the biggest event of my entire year? And the web says no. And I say, but we've got a majority of 52. I mean, please. And he says no because essentially the place runs like a really rubbish boarding school in which all the nice kids were killed by scarlet fever, and only the bullies are left, right? So when he's saying no, he's not saying I need you for the vote. He's just saying no because I'm the parent web, and it amuses me to say no, right? So I say, but I'm not going to be able to get to the constituency in time, and the cabinet minister's coming. And he said, well, when did you get a train? I said, well, the last train is at 7:30 and the boat's at 7. And he says, I bet there's, and sure enough there is, there's a night bus that changes at Preston at 2 in the morning, unless you get your constituency code. So, set up, and I arrived, and the biscuits ready, and tea ready, and I've got 120 broadband activists already in Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State steps out of his, and he turns to his aide, and he says, and I'm coming up to meet him, and I just sort of overhear the conversation. He says, what the hell is this? We don't have time for this. Go get on the next meeting. This is not happening. And turns around and gets straight back in the car and drives off, leaving me with all my broadband activists. No, it's a time, they're not the sort of thing you normally write about in a book, because normally you're trying to write about big scandals, and of course I'm not, it's not something that any newspaper picks up, because it's not bad enough for Jeremy Hunt to be sort of pilloried on the front page. And nobody has ever heard of Swain the pairing with. And nobody cares about broadband in Cumbria very much, as I discovered. But it's a sort of way, and I try through stories like that to sort of let you see what type of scarlet fever wiped out boarding school this really is.
The other thing you talk about a lot, which is quite startling, is the lack of effort of many elected leaders to really understand the nitty-gritty of the issues that they're passionate about. And I actually had this conversation about your book with a friend of mine in politics who said, well, hold on a second, the jobs of the politicians are to be politicians, right? And not necessarily to have a granular level of knowledge or understanding of the issues, but their advice from the people whose job it is to be experts, the civil servants, one presumes, and then kind of push for change or direct whatever is needed. I found it interesting as well because you draw a very stark contrast with some of the American elected officials who you met, who went out of their way to show how they had assiduously studied the topics that they were covering. But what do you make of this idea that, to be a politician, you don't really need to know the issues in depth. You just need to know how to get shit done, basically.
Well, it's a very interesting, and it's absolutely right, as Clarissa says, I'd be fascinated to know who it was, maybe she'll tell me. No, that's exactly right. That's what my colleagues tell themselves. It's a very, very bizarre idea. Because if you sort of unpick it, what are they actually imagining? So, you know nothing about the subject. And when I mean nothing, you literally know nothing. Right? To illustrate what I mean by knowing nothing. I was appointed as a minister in the Foreign Office, sent in by Theresa May to see my boss, who was Boris Johnson, who was the Foreign Secretary, to ask which part of the world I was going to be assigned. So he said, thanks, Rory, what would you like? And I say, well, I spent most of the last 15 years of my life focused on the Middle East and Asia. I speak 3 Asian languages. I've just been the DFID Middle East Asia Minister for the last year. I know the heads of state, I understand the programs in detail. So I don't really mind where, but I guess Middle East or Asia. And he says, what about Africa? But for instance, I don't know anything about Africa. I've been there once on holiday. And he goes, come on, Rory, what's the capital of Uganda? I said, I don't know what the capital of Uganda is. And he goes, Rory, come on, you're lying to me. It's Kampala. So sure enough, I take over as African Minister. And it's just ridiculous. But I cannot tell you. When I say I knew nothing about it, literally I would not have been able to find Cameroon on a map, let alone name the 6 countries that had land borders with Cameroon. Had any understanding. The level of my ignorance is kind of beyond imagination. Okay, so imagine that, right? Someone like me gets the job. Now follow up on Clarissa's model that this politician, whose name I'm going to extract over a drink, is going to be him. So, I don't know anything. And not just I don't know anything, with many of my colleagues, I don't know anything, and I don't intend to find out anything either. right? I mean, I took that job, and the first thing I did is I used most of the summer holidays traveling through Africa, and we went to 10 countries, and I read Africa, and I went to Cape Town. That is not what your friend is suggesting they do, right? No. Because they have this idea that you can somehow know nothing, and then your civil servants somehow come up with ideas, and then you sort of sift and listen to them, and on the basis of that, right? But what is really happening? So your civil servants come into you and they say, great news in Zimbabwe, Mugabe's been toppled, and this lovely new person who's my friend, and I'm the ambassador in Marawi, who's called Emerson the Crocodile Mnangagwa, is just taking over as the new leader, and we really need to make friends with this person, and it's a great opportunity for the UK. What do you do with that information? Right, you might be like, it's a bit weird, this nice guy's called Emerson the Crocodile. But that's about all, right? Well, okay, the ambassador says it's a really good guy, right? And now I'm going to get shit done. What does that mean? What are you going to do? Right? I mean, so the very, very odd idea of management. And of course, the real reason why they talk about this is that every culture, every organization depends on what. So what are the incentives for a politician? The incentives for a politician are holding your constituency and getting promoted up the ministerial ladder. And getting promoted up the ministerial ladder is essentially just about being nice to the Prime Minister and going out on television repeating the standard. Look at the most dramatic example who joined Parliament with me in 2010, who was that extraordinary phenomenon, Liz Truss.
She does not come off well in the book.
Right. Liz Truss is absolutely amazing. So Liz Truss, said to me, Rory, I don't know why you're interested in foreign affairs, it's something the Foreign Office should be abolished, and then became Foreign Secretary. She says to me, I don't believe in the difference between rural and urban areas, I've got absolutely no interest in farming and the environment, and she's made the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, right? Does it in any way affect her career, one iota, that she knows nothing about those subjects, frequently says things which are quite idiotic? She humiliates herself, banging on about English cheese and weird speeches and
apples.
Weird speeches, sausages, nobody cares. Doesn't go to visit the national parks, nobody cares. Doesn't get on with the farmers, nobody cares. Alienates all her officials in the Foreign Office, nobody cares. Her ascent is seamless. The first person from my intake in the cabinet, made Foreign Secretary, and ultimately Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And then, like your wonderful friend, she's like, I don't know shit, but I'm going to get stuff done. Right? How about we just, borrow a lot more and get rid of the Office of Budget Responsibility and sack the Permanent Secretary and the Treasury, and Kwasi and I can just romp our way to growth. How about that? And then you're like, but Prime Minister, there's all this detailed stuff that you don't understand, and there's bond markets, and there's the currency, and there's interest rates, and there's... No, I'm a politician. I don't do detail. I just get stuff done. I'm dynamic. I'm vigorous, right? I have 10 years to save the West.
You say something, you repeated the refrain, and nobody cares, and nobody cares. And it does feel like we're living in this era of deep cynicism, where people don't have faith in democratic institutions, they don't have faith in politicians, they don't have faith in the mainstream media, and maybe they're not seeing very clearly what that ultimately portends and the erosive character that has on our democracy. I'm conscious that I want to open up the floor to questions, but I really would like to get your thoughts on what you would do to two specific conflicts, and obviously this is a lot to do in one question, but the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and what's happening in Gaza, these are really crucially important issues for any world we live. Do you think they've been dealt with in a responsible way? Do you think there's a better way to try to tackle them? And do you think, I really, really hope, do you think that our elected leaders do care about doing the right thing? Not justice, but in terms of the right thing for humanity? It's a big question, sorry.
In the current context, I guess the two words that spring to mind are restraint and hope. And they're quite difficult ideas to follow through on, because our tendency is, in the West, is to lurch from doing far too much, Iraq and Afghanistan, or doing far too little, the Middle East peace process. And what we need to redevelop is a sense of who we are, what we can do. The can is really important, and the restraint, the prudence, the caution comes out from Iraq and Afghanistan, is we have an incredible megalomaniac tendency to exaggerate our power in the world, to believe that we can fix other people's societies, and we end up doing so at enormous cost to other people and enormous cost to ourselves. But the lesson of that should not be pessimism. It should not be isolation. It should be the other bit, which is the hope bit. And the truth is that we can work with other people, with other people. This is not kind of the US or the UK waving magic wands. We can work with other people. It's better. Right? The world is not predetermined. But the way to make things better is to recognize the problems as they are without losing hope. Right, so what are the problems as they are? The problem in Ukraine is that because it was overly cautious, essentially, in its support for Ukraine, very, very generous, and Ukraine would not be where it was if it wasn't for tens of billions of dollars US support, but overly cautious. Essentially, the war in Ukraine has acted like a low-dose antibiotic on the Russian military, and the Russian military is stronger than it was 2.5 years ago, and Ukraine is struggling to hold on to its front lines. And it's very difficult to imagine next year either that the US and its allies will provide the amount of money required, or that the Ukrainian military will be able to reconfigure it to significant amounts of territory. So that's the realism, that's understanding grim reality, understanding where our limits are, what we can do, what we can't do, what the picture is. Right? I mean, I think like fighting a war, you need to begin by looking at what your troops are doing, what the other troops are doing, what the ground is, before you start counter sites. In addition to Israel and Palestine, we have to acknowledge that this is as bad as we have ever seen it in the Middle East. All you have to do is flip, as I sometimes try to do, between Arabic, Hebrew language media, to see that there are two communities living in completely different universes. And this extends to the United Kingdom. I have Jewish friends in North London who are absolutely up for invading Lebanon and going after Hezbollah, and essentially just want the conversation to be about October 7th and refuse to acknowledge that anything has gone wrong in the response in Gaza. And on the other hand, my friends in Jordan are increasingly in a world where I think they find it very, very difficult to acknowledge the existence of war. Right? So we have to be in a world in which we have principles. What are the principles? The principles are, we need to recognize a Palestinian state, and we also need to recognize that the Jewish community in Israel is there to stay, right? Into a world of sort of fantasizing that we're going to a pre-1948 universe, right? 1948 is a very long time ago. Refighting the rights or wrongs of 1948 is not the way to go. Refighting the rights or wrongs is never really the way to go. And this is where the hope comes in. Get back to Russia, Ukraine. But on Israel, Palestine, if we've been talking in this room in the 1980s, and we've been talking about apartheid in South Africa, we've been talking about peace in Northern Ireland, 80% of the room would have explained it was impossible. These communities were so embedded in their particular ideologies like this would never happen. Right? Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland, bring it close to home, forget South Africa for a moment. All his interests were no surrender, no compromise, and yet the miracle happened. Peace came from peace can, this is absolutely possible. Absolutely possible. And the type of realism that becomes extreme pessimism is exactly what we need to avoid. We need to rediscover the capacity to believe in things that will feel like miracles, and not for that reason impossible.
I think a lot of people tonight will hear how earnest and eloquent and passionate you are, and will want to know whether you would consider, again, running for something or other, whether that chapter is over.
That conversation is like an hour and a half peering into my soul over a drink. It's not really where you want to go, but part of the answers to that are contained in the book.
And I know that something that you wanted to talk about, and maybe it also pertains to the book, but is writing. Is that something you want to do more of? And what kind of writing?
So I'm proud of this book. It's my fourth book. And many people in the room, I guess, are writers. And I'm really pleased with it. I'm really pleased with it, partly because I managed to have the most incredibly patient editor. Word manuscript, and they'd asked for 80,000. Gave me another, basically 12 months, which allowed me to step away from the book for 3-4 months, not even look at it, and then come back in and cut and fight and cut and fight. So that the book is the first book I've produced, which is about as good as I could get it. It doesn't mean it's a great book, but it's about as good as I can do.
It is a great book.
And I've really, so I would like to try to make it and think again. And I think that it feels like kind of marginal activity in my work, and my marginal activity is social media, marginal activity sees that we face, but, people listen to podcasts, wrestling, but my gut instinct is maybe in the end, the book has more impact.
I have about 1,000 more questions, but I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to let you guys ask questions. But here's the thing. I'm sure you're all really dynamic, articulate people with super interesting views on a number of issues. However, for the sake of everyone's sanity and the fact that we all really want to hear from Rory, can you please just phrase it as a question? Yeah, we can take 2 at a time. So, yeah.
Hi, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about prisons, your view of the appointment of James Simpson, and these are creating a bit of a thereabout for itself. I mean, one of the outcomes is potentially more people getting let out early. Do you think this is something, it seems kind of weird to think the tax reversed on all that, obviously.
And another question? Yeah. Who has the second microphone back there? Yep.
An optimist, and if so, what?
Prisons and optimism.
So I'm very pleased that Labour is taking prisons seriously. Prisons are a complete disgrace. They're disgusting in this country. We have 87 the Victorian also, as the Labour government said, you're going to be more tough on crime. They're running on giving people longer prison sentences. One of the major reasons not short sentences is longer sentences. If you think about it, somebody gets, I don't know, 6 months sentence. You can put, you can put 20 of them compared to giving a single person a 10-year sentence, right? So the longer the sentences, the more these prisons fill up. So that's what I'm worried about. And the bear trap problem is not so much, I think, that they're going to go super liberal on prisons and be punished by the electorate. I think it's more that they've signalled a desire to be progressive in prisons, and I suspect they're not going to have the money, they're not going to have the will to do the radical things that James really wants to do, and then there'll be a pretty dramatic part afterwards. Am I an optimist? Yes, I am an optimist, and I think that optimism is increasingly a moral science. I think optimism is necessary. And that's why I'm talking about miracles in Northern Ireland. Look, the fight for democracy, stepping back and looking at it, doesn't look so great, right? It looks pretty grim. Autocratic backside. But optimism is a moral stance, because optimism is about hope, and hope is about faith, and it's about asserting that the world will one day be a world that respects the perspective of votes, that is more liberal, is more democratic, that these things really matter. They matter morally. And being pessimistic, fearing the worst, can often simply lead to inaction, and lead to making the world believe that actually hope in the best sense is central, because you surprise yourself by achieving more than you did.
Two more questions out front row from, and then one.
Hi, thanks very much. We, as humans and the media, can only sort of cope with so much in our attention. Thinking of the conflict in places like Yemen that you mentioned, Sudan, Myanmar and so on, how should we try to decide which of these conflicts we keep in our minds, we keep up to date on, or should we just follow whatever the media are report on, because that's all we can do?
Really great question. So the answer on that is that you need properly funded, relatively independent, well-functioning machines. Foreign policy, security, development assistance machines. What you cannot do is try to reduce everything that you're involved in internationally to a question of what voters are interested in today in Flint, Michigan, or Bradford. It doesn't work. And it's a tendency driven by Trump, but it's one that we've all inherited. Right? International development spending is dropping around the world, foreign services are being cut to the bone, embassies are being shut, less and less energy is put into the United Nations. And it's no good. If you want a more peaceful global order, if you want fewer refugees, fewer internally displaced people, fewer conflict, you need a system that works, and it's a system that has to work even when people aren't paying attention. And the job of that system is to try, insofar as you can, to get humanitarian assistance into Sudan, to support the peace processes, however difficult they are in places like Yemen, to put pressure on the governments, because almost all these conflicts, possible exception Myanmar. Right? Myanmar is a very, very indigenous domestic conflict driven by a horrendous military junta. But Sudan, Yemen, these are proxy wars. Right? These are countries which are really being torn apart because UAE is backing Houthi through Chad into Sudan. The Iranians are backing Houthis in Yemen. The Saudis are funding the other side. Right? So that is stuff that you can, as an international community, get involved in. Right? You use all the different forms of power at your disposal, your aid, your political contacts, your negotiations, to push those things in a more positive direction. It's been done again and again. It was done actually quite successfully through the 90s and 2000s. From 1990 to 2014, every single year, there were fewer refugees, fewer internally displaced people, fewer civilians going home. And that didn't happen just by accident. Right? That was partly that it was a functioning international system. But we need to build that up again and be confident about saying, not all of this is about winning votes in the next election. Some of the stuff might be boring or irrelevant to voters. That's fair enough. But it's also true that there are other things that are boring and relevant to voters. They may not be very interested in MRI machines. Right? They may not be very interested if you're in southern England in the ferry service from the Western Isles. That doesn't mean you don't do it.
That question there, and then you're going to ask your question, and then you'll do two in one again.
Hi, I just wanted to ask your opinion on whether you think things may get better in Iran.
With that question there,
So my question is there anything to change about the current system to inspire more young people to enter politics?
Gosh, okay. So Iran, Iran, interesting. So the candidate who's just won as president was barred from running in the last election. So he's sufficiently on the reformist side for the supreme leader to have been to be concerned about him last time. He is interesting. You know, he's a different generation. He did his medical studies partly under the Shah. Right? He's a product of the world before the revolution. Of course, he remained in Iran. He provided medical assistance on the front line. He's been a member of the Iranian parliament. But he comes from the northwest, so he comes from, not from the main Persian Shia heartland, but from the predominantly Sunni, Azeri, Kurdish regions up around Tabriz in the northwest. His wife was a gynecologist, a very credentialed gynecologist in Carthage. His advisor, Mohammed Zarif, was much more open, and he was the architect of the Iran nuclear deal. So look, don't get overly optimistic. I mean, in the end, he was allowed to run by the supreme leader. In the end, he makes polite comments about the Revolutionary Guard, but he's definitely, and he doesn't have as much power as the owner, but it's definitely a positive development, right? It's a development in the right direction, and at a very, very important time when tensions are rising. How do you get young people involved in politics? And one thing I'd like to do is I'd like compulsory voting, which really annoys everybody. But usually the answer against compulsory voting is, have you ever met a voter? Well, listen, we're a democracy, right? People are like, yeah, but voters are really ignorant, and, you know, really we shouldn't encourage them to vote when they don't know what they're talking about. That's democracy, right? That's the deal, right? So I think we should compel people to vote, and I think by compelling people to vote, that might bring more young people to politics. And actually, interestingly, if you look at Parliament at the moment, the problem isn't young people going to Parliament, the problem is stuffed full of young people. Right? Even Rishi Sunak's shadow cabinet, one of the youngest things ever on record, the people aged 51 are like part of a gerontocracy in the shadow cabinet. And in Keir Starmer's cabinet, you know, he gets pat himself on the shoulder of being the venerable age of 62, but almost everybody, you know, West Street has taken over the whole health centre, but only turned 40. There's been a Labour MP elected at the age of 22. Right? So I sometimes think the problem is in the other direction, right? What's happened to all the experience? What's happened to the older people?
our host this evening, Paul, has a question.
Rory, I want to ask you a question about the very exciting topic of planning reform. Partly because I think it presents a democratic conundrum. If you want to get a good ban, we're going to have to have planning reform. If you want to have onshore wind, which has just come back from a de facto ban, you need onshore wind. But sometimes you take power away from local communities in order to get a collective good, and these things can be in tension with each other. So how do you design something that facilitates things that we all need without draining power away from local communities, which can be NIMBYs?
Well, it's the central challenge, and Paul's absolutely right. I mean, of course, authoritarian regimes like China can drive infrastructure projects through very, very, very quickly. And why can we not? You know, we've been talking about signalling on the Piccadilly line since 1974. talking about the third runway at Heathrow since 1995. HS2, Gordon Brown announced in 2008 was going to deliver £100 billion worth of benefits, and it cost $20 billion. By last year, the cost had got up to £120 billion with £100 billion worth of benefits, and was cancelled at the cost of many billions, right? So we're really rubbish at it. And why are we not building enough houses? And look, these things are complicated, but there is some logic in saying if the government's bringing in 700,000 new people net a year to the United Kingdom and building 100,000 houses, we don't have enough houses. We're not going to have enough houses. We don't have enough houses. So those get self-fulfilled. Housing, infrastructure, they're trying to double the amount of onshore wind. So how do they do it? Generally the answer has to be in a democracy. Radical devolution.
Power to local mayors and local areas, and being much smarter and more flexible and more thoughtful with the way in which you listen to communities and provide solutions that work too. You need to find a conversation that says, this number of houses is non-negotiable, but we're going to be much more flexible about listening to you, about where exactly around this town you want those houses to be, what you want those houses to look like, who you want to live in those houses, right? So what does that mean? That means that you might say that you want 10 houses on the edge of each village instead of 1,000 on the edge of a town. It might mean that you want local families prioritized or low-income families prioritized. It might mean that you want more traditional architecture, and the cost of that is that it's going to cost you slightly more to build the infrastructure. Right? The government is only going to be able to get this in the ground by spending slightly more per unit, either through showing more flexibility towards local communities, or by essentially providing cash incentives. But I think the first is better. Devolution and including those local communities in the design process. And it has worked. But it requires people, it requires more money, and it requires a lot of time and focus. But if you really focus, you can get it done. You know, we got some really tough housing projects built in Cumbria within 2 years. It's not impossible to do by any means, but you've really got to want to do it. And you've got to get out of the government's mindset, which is my way or the highway, and then giving up and losing interest and just waffling off, which is what, unfortunately, basically it's looked like for the last, not just last 14 years, last 20 years.
I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. So I'm conscious that I'm not over at the back, way over there. And we'll do them in a duo again. So you over at the back, and then I've not done anyone over there.
Hi Rory, I'm a huge fan of the podcast. Over the last 50 years in this country, economic and productivity growth has been continually going down, besides whether it's Labour or Conservative. I was just wondering, do you think that is a contributing factor to either the rise of populism or the increased voter apathy, particularly young people like myself?
Number two.
Thank you. My question is about multilateralism in the world, and to what extent can that be ascribed to lack of global leadership? And do you think the appointment of Keir Starmer will probably change that? And how do we make multilateralism sexy again?
Multilateralism sexy again. I think one of the challenges is that the multilateral players are not very interested in rebuilding an international security structure. You know, Narendra Modi was embracing the great bear hug Vladimir Putin just yesterday. We found ourselves in a situation in which South Africa is on the one hand taking genocide cases and on the other hand flirting with Russian naval exercises. We're in a situation in which there is a radical gap now between the old West and a lot of the rest of the world on very basic things, and in which many of the middle powers are playing crazy games. Libya, Somalia, these places have become cockpits for Turkey, Qatar, UAE, Egypt, and even in some cases Ethiopia, all playing their own different types of games. Right? This is, so yes, a lot of it has to do with US leadership, a lot of it could be about European leadership, but of course that's in trouble because European leadership is generally, traditionally, in the absence of the United Kingdom, and that's another reason to regret Brexit if you want other reasons to regret Brexit, right, was traditionally driven to a large extent by the German Chancellor and the French President, and the German Chancellor has a net popularity rating of -57, and the French President has just destroyed all his effective governing power through a catastrophic decision 2.5 weeks ago. Productivity and the UK economy. Yes, absolutely. Look, but not just the UK. The reason that all these democracies are discredited around the world is that from 1804 to 2004, you could draw a direct connection between being a democracy and economic growth. And there was even a story, this modernization hypothesis, that said the only way to really do well economically is to be a democracy, and as you get wealthier, you're going to want to be a democracy, so the middle class is going to want both. And that was destroyed by the rise of China. Right? China took off. It's an extraordinary exponential curve. The Chinese economy is smaller than the British economy as recently as 2004, now 8 times larger than the British economy, and it didn't become a democracy overall. And the malaise of our countries is deep and probably permanent. I mean, that's the problem. It's very tempting to say growth, productivity, and that of course is what the great Liz Truss presumably got out of bed in the morning and thought she was going to fix. Right? But a lot of it is to do with the loss of our industrial base, our debt, our demography, right? The fact that we're going to have twice as many people aged over 85, and when look back to the times when growing fast, right? Early 1900s, we had 20 working people for every 1 retired person. We've now got 3 working people for every 1 retired person. About to drop down to 2.5. So I don't think, and there are also other reasons, right? We also like our welfare state, we like our comforts, we like our regulation, we like a lot of the good progressive things which stop us growing as ferociously fast as China or even the United States, right? I mean, we've got to be honest with ourselves. And this is another thing, amongst the many things that went wrong with Brexit. The fantasy of, I guess, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Rishi Sunak, one catastrophic fantasy was they believed they were in a free trade environment in which they could go and make free trade deals with India and China and the US, and they hadn't realized the whole world was going protectionist at exactly the moment they were trying to open up their borders. But their second mistake is they thought that everything that was holding them back was the EU, and if they just left the EU, they would be able to radically deregulate, privatize, pour poo into our rivers, and do all the jolly stuff they want to do, right? And pour poo into our rivers is an interesting example. Why are our rivers filthy? Why does the water minister? Our rivers are filthy, partly because I was the water minister, but partly also because it would cost in the region of £25 billion at least to clean up our rivers and beaches. If you're going on the full productivity economic growth model, you'd say, listen, most people don't go to those beaches, most people don't swim in those rivers, we don't really give a shit, we're not going to spend £25 billion on that, right? Add to any form of investment that we feel proud of. Air quality, environment, right? Generally speaking, the Treasury, let's take net zero. Right, the Treasury numbers at the moment suggest that net zero will cost the UK economy something in the region of £1 trillion. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to do it, doesn't mean there couldn't be very good reasons to do it. And I am sure that 70% of the people in the room believe we can do it and also grow our economy enormously and have fantastic productivity and growth. It's not what the Treasury thinks. Right? So we are trying massively to have our cake and eat it. We're dreaming of Chinese levels of growth. While we're aging, we've got enormous amounts of debt, and we actually really quite enjoy quite a lot of the things and investments that we're making, which are not necessarily the most efficient ways of generating growth. And we may even question whether we actually want growth. I mean, after all, we're living on a planet with finite resources. Infinite growth is not great for a planet with finite resources. Right? Kate Raworth in Donut Economics would suggest that this country's grown enough, that actually to be equitable we need to start shrinking our economy. But we have a government who's just been elected promising the fastest sustained growth in the G7.
We are out of time, but I wonder, just to close, whether you could answer sort of a silly little question, and it can be a silly answer or a profound answer, it just has to be a relatively short answer, which is, what keeps you up at night, and then what helps you fall asleep?
Okay, what keeps me up at night is the general bullshit of our society. Media, politics, culture, it's crap, right? The whole context that creates Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and Liz Truss is crap, and we're part of that crap, right? We facilitate all of this, right? This uselessness out of which this rubbish emerges, we're part of. We should take responsibility for that. What helps me go to sleep? What helps me go to sleep is really recommend. It's a recording, the Royal National Institute of the Blind, of a 18th century novel called The Life and Adventures of Tristram Shandy Gentleman. Now, if anybody would like to get a book signed, I'm going to go to the other side, but I'm literally, there's quite a lot of people, and I'd like to get back with you. I'm literally going to be signing. I'm not going to be standing and doing long chats, but I'd be honoured to sign books if people want, but it is a signature, not a long conversation.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a big round of applause.